Welcome. Today's video on the Great War will look at the main battles of 1918 and examine the concept of total war in World War I. First, on the Eastern Front, we, in the last video, discussed how after the Kerensky Offensive, Germany was able to establish a general advance into Russia after the shattering of the Russian army. So, in the early part of 1918, the Germans finish off a drive into the Baltics, into the Ukraine, seizing Estonia, Minsk, Kiev, several of the key capitals and major cities in that part of Russia, leading to the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. This is the treaty of surrender of Russia to Germany. Even though Russia was on the Allied side, Russia loses World War I. Many people ignore that simple fact. Russia was on the Allied, the winning side, and yet they surrendered to Germany 6 months or so before the end of the war on the Western Front. So this Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, Germany demanded reparations payments from Russia. Germany demanded large swaths of territory in Eastern Europe from Russia. Sound familiar? These are things that the Allies will inflict upon Germany in the Treaty of Versailles after the end of the war entirely. Now, it was not the Tsar who agreed to negotiate this treaty, nor was it Kerensky and the democratic government. This was Vladimir Lenin, this was Trotsky, this were the Bolsheviks, the Russian communists who had seized power in the Red October Revolution in 1917. More significantly, on the Western Front, the Germans, after having defeated Russia, finally are able to unite all of their forces of the entire German army for one last knockout blow against the Allies. They're running against the clock because every month tens of thousands of fresh American troops are arriving, and they are hoping to win the war before those American troops can make a difference. How are they able to break through the trench lines? Well, in their long experience of this war, Germans have developed, not from Star Wars, but the original concept of stormtroopers. The German stormtroopers use infiltration tactics. They would do this insanely dangerous job of infiltrating through enemy trench lines at night in small groups without arms fire, and would get into the second line, into the third line, and then when the attack would begin, they would have already penetrated the enemy trenches and caused terrible confusion and be able to attack from multiple angles. This was terribly disruptive to the Allied trenches. Next, they also had perfected the art of rolling artillery. Many other attacks involved terrible, devastating artillery fire that would go on for days or hours at least. The German strategy was to use artillery and to begin distancing their shots further back and begin crossing no man's land and begin approaching the enemy trenches while your own German artillery was still hitting it. Therefore, by the time the artillery had stopped hitting the enemy trenches, the German infantry were already very close or right on top of the enemy when they came out of their bomb-proof dugouts, and so they mastered that way of breaking through. And so, over the course of spring and summer of 1918, the German army actually managed to penetrate the Allied lines in a series of continuous breakthroughs. This brings us to the climactic Second Battle of the Marne, on a similar battlefield to the first one with similar effects. That first battle was that climactic point of the Schlieffen Plan, where the German army failed to defeat France at the beginning. And with a similar result here is the Second Battle of the Marne in 1918, where the Germans are trying to knock out France before the Americans are there in enough numbers, and once again they fail. This battle, much like the first one, takes place with a lot less trench warfare. They've broken through, they're on relatively open terrain. It's a true slugfest of a battle, but the Germans are at the end of their supply line, they're exhausted, and the Allies once again hold the German army and stop them again on the banks of the Marne River at the Second Battle of the Marne. This leads the Allies to launch a massive counterattack called the 100 Days Offensive in the fall of 1918. And they meet with extraordinary success. Why are the Allies now successful when they had been blocked so long by the Germans? Why? The British, after having been devastated and shattered at the Battle of the Somme in 1916, have finally rebuilt and are prepared for a full-scale offensive. The AEF, the American Expeditionary Force, under General John J. Pershing, the commander of the American Army, is finally there in meaningful numbers after having started a draft in 1916. It took over a year to build a meaningfully sized American army in Europe. Now they were there. They were fresh. They were brave and courageous, almost stupid compared to some of the Allied troops who had been so beaten down and demoralized by the devastation of this war. Having these fresh, courageous Americans there who hadn't suffered as much as the other troops had was a major thing propelling the Allies. The French morale, which had been shattered in the Nivelle offensive and having to attack the Hindenburg Line, for the first time they were able to counterattack the Germans, and they barely had trenches, or the ones they had were brand new and not very sophisticated, and their supply lines were very long. The French troops were delighted to have a chance to fight the Germans outside of their invincible trench lines. They finally have tanks in meaningful numbers. They were closer to their own supply lines, and by contrast, the Germans were exhausted, out of position. Their supply lines were long and ran across no man's land and many miles of previously used trenches. They didn't have solid railroad connections to supply them. They were exhausted, and the Allies' 100 Days Offensive begins to push the German army almost entirely out of France and Belgium and almost all the way back into Germany. And it's at that point that the Germans will ask for a ceasefire, and their army finally begins to collapse from exhaustion in the war. And we'll talk about how that ends the war. A brief summary of some other fronts. The war at sea. Germany had been practicing unrestricted submarine warfare since 1916, that had, 1917, that had brought the Americans into the war in 1917. The German fleet finally surrendered, mutinied against their own commanders at the end of 1918. In Italy, remember the Germans had pushed Italy deep into Venetia after the Battle of Caporetto in 1917. Well, again, the Germans are exhausted. Italy makes a counterattack. They push into Austria-Hungary, capturing the major Austrian seaport, Trieste, which was also a piece of Italian Irredenta. It was an Italian city that the Italians wanted, but it was Austria's main seaport. Sort of a fun fact, if you're ever watching the movie The Sound of Music, and you know Captain von Trapp was in the Austrian Navy, and as a child you look at the map and realize that Austria was landlocked. Well, remember, he was in the Austrian Navy in World War I, where they had a major seaport. That will be taken from Austria and given to Italy after World War I. At the end of the war, Bulgaria is defeated by the Allies on the Ottoman front. The Ottomans had attempted to invade Russia and Armenia from the south, but again, the British, with Arab allies, are pushing through into Damascus, Syria, and just like their other Central Powers, the Ottomans will surrender at the end of 1918. Secondly, let's talk about this concept of total war. Total war is the idea that all resources of your country and the enemy country are part of the war effort. Okay? And first, we'll speak about enemy resources, and considering the enemy resources or the battlefront are part of the war effort, this means that enemy civilians are fair game. We've studied wars where civilians are fair game, and there's murder and rape, and cities are sacked, and but by contrast, you also have eras of chivalry, or in the 18th century, where you had more rules of war, and war was more like a chess game. Total war is the idea that civilians are fair game because civilians lead to manpower, and civilians lead to industrial production, and civilians lead to farming that supplies an army with food. And so civilians being killed is not something drastically to be avoided, but it's something that helps your side to win the war. And the same goes for enemy resources. Burning fields, destroying cities, blockading them with your navy, or blockading them with U-boats, or closing a strait and choking off any and all resources, even food, even medicine, because it helps to supply the enemy army, and you do not consider the humanitarian relief of the enemy civilians because they are the enemy. It is total war. On the home front, these are your resources are also considered part of the war effort. And so you see the example of conscription. Remember that conscription, in other words, is the draft, is considering all of the men, all of the manpower of your country is a resource to be used in the battle. Therefore, Britain and eventually the United States and other countries all universally adopted universal conscription, drafting most all young men, virtually age 16 to 40 in many of these countries were all subject to the draft. Okay. Another example would be all sorts of government controls. Since all resources are part of the war effort, you see the government establishing price controls and rationing the critical goods, things that would be useful in the war effort, a lot of food, metals, supplies that would be useful for the government establishes. No matter how much money you have, you can't buy more than a certain amount of a thing, and that is called rationing as part of total war. Another aspect of total war, in a way, is the concept of propaganda. Propaganda, in short, is one-sided information. Okay, and we'll look at many different types. This takes many different forms. You could consider propaganda as being simply any type of government-produced media. Okay, anything the government produces, in a way, could be considered propaganda because it's trying to persuade your own people or people in another country to see things from the perspective of the government. This can also take the form of censorship, can be a form of propaganda, where the government prohibits the use of stories that are harmful to the government's story. Another thing to consider in propaganda is that not all propaganda is created equal. In a way, you could have propaganda that is basically true. It simply is a good story. Things that are basically true yet are favorable to the government's narrative, in a way, can be propaganda, even if it's basically true. You could also have the truth with spin. It's truthy. It has the ring of truth. It contains truth, but maybe omits things that are harmful to the government narrative. These are also examples of propaganda. And finally, straight up lies, right? Things that are blatantly not true is obviously a form of propaganda, where the government simply says things not at all true, but are very difficult to debunk or prove their untruth, and therefore a popular type of propaganda that governments used in the First World War. And finally, another concept of propaganda is when you manipulate the authorship. So any of these types of propaganda, whether it's true or spin or lies, could be called white propaganda, where you list accurately the author of the piece. You can also make gray propaganda, where the government simply releases it and says the staff, the government, sources say, and you don't put an author. And again, you could have no author of a piece and have it be true or spin or lies, and that's considered gray propaganda. You can also release black propaganda, where you release it with an author's name and you tell lies or spin or truth, but you lie about who the author is. And again, due to maybe censorship or heavy government influence, it's hard to disprove that. And finally, the ask a question here about total war is the idea of, can a war be total from only one side? For example, in the Vietnam War, where the Vietnamese fought using everything at their disposal, in a way it was a total war from their perspective. Yet, on the American side, the U.S. showed restraint and did not use nuclear weapons. So a total war can be considered total from both sides, like World War I and World War II, or not so, like in the Vietnam War. Thanks for watching.